Hello everybody, I'm Jeremy Dickinson. I thank you all for watching. Welcome to my YouTube channel, Philosophy Clips. In this philosophy clip, I will continue my discussion of the moral system of the 20th century British philosopher W.D. Ross. So in part one of this video series, I introduced Ross's pluralistic system, and in this video, what I'm going to do is talk about that part of his system that's known as his normative theory, which is also pluralistic. So I'll be talking about Ross's normative pluralism in this video. But let me do some stage setting before we dive into his normative pluralism. So you may recall from seeing part one of this video series, but Ross, when he developed his moral philosophy, when he developed his moral theory, he's responding in part to the utilitarian tradition, and he's also responding to the Kantian tradition. The Kantian tradition is part of what many of you may know is called the duty-based tradition in ethics. And Ross ultimately is going to side with Kant and be a duty-based philosopher, but he gives us a non-Kantian option with respect to being a duty-based philosopher. In this way, he's opposed to the utilitarian tradition. So we saw that Ross, he's opposed to the utilitarian tradition because it doesn't adequately account for our special obligations to each other. The theory, as it were, is too agent neutral fundamentally to be the correct moral theory. Moreover, Ross, he claims that utilitarianism does a good job in getting one of the fundamental principles of morality right, and that's the principle that involves promoting the happiness of others. In his system, he ends up calling it a principle of beneficence. So what Ross wants to claim is utilitarianism provides but one of the fundamental moral principles and tries to reduce all other principles to that single principle. Ross is a pluralist, so he goes against the monism of a traditional utilitarian view. But he also goes against the monism of a Kantian view, the Kantian view that gives us the categorical imperative. So here I'm talking about normative ethical theories. With the Kantian system, Kant's fundamental normative principle is the categorical imperative. And what Ross wants to say is that the categorical imperative, by his lights, is false because it doesn't square properly with ordinary moral thinking. In particular, Ross wants to claim that the categorical imperative on Kant's lights entails that it's never permissible to tell a lie, and Ross says, of course there are permissible cases to tell lies. Those are cases when, at least for example, we could protect someone from unnecessary serious harm, just for example. So Ross, he thinks that the utilitarian system fails, he thinks that the Kantian system fails. They're both monistic systems, the monism fails in both. And the monism fails in part, according to Ross, because monism counts against, again, our ordinary common sense moral thinking. Common sense moral thinking tells us that there are multiple fundamental principles, moral principles, to guide our behaviors. So Ross, though, does want to side with Kant in being opposed to the utilitarian or the consequentialist tradition more broadly. And so Ross is in the duty-based tradition. To be in the duty-based tradition really means that you're opposed to the utilitarian tradition. Sometimes some philosophers have claimed that the duty-based system is really a system that is defined negatively. So one's in the duty-based tradition, or one endorses a duty-based ethics when one thinks that at least sometimes, with respect to some actions, something other than the consequences of the action determine the action's correctness, the action's rightness. So that's all that's required really to be a duty-based theorist, at least roughly put. There might be some fine points that would have to be made here, but Ross is squarely in the duty-based tradition, and he gives us theorists a duty-based option that isn't Kantian. That's important to note. So hopefully you're feeling like Ross's system, his moral system, is clear. You see how it's different from the utilitarian tradition. You see how it's different from the Kantian system from a big picture vantage point. He's going to develop a duty-based system that is pluralistic, goes against the Kantian monism of the categorical imperative. So what is Ross's alternative? What is Ross's positive view? So far, we know he's a pluralist. Positively, we know that he's done some destructive work in terms of trying to dismantle some of the alternative views available to him. But what does he have positively to say? Well, Ross, he's famous for providing us with a system of principles he calls the prima facie duties, prima facie principles. Now, what is it that makes these principles prima facie in the first place? Well, maybe I should say one word or so about what it means for a principle to be prima facie. It means that the principle generally holds but doesn't always hold. So in this way, I think it might be helpful to think about prima facie duties um, um, in terms of the contrast concept of Kant's categorical duties. So the categorical duties for Kant were such that they hold in an exceptionalist kind of way. Ross wants to claim that moral principles aren't like that. Moral principles are more like rules of thumb that generally hold but don't always hold. So the prima facie duties are duties, ultimately, that generally hold but don't always hold. That's no knock against them. That's just how morality functions. So this doesn't in any way commit Ross to a kind of relativism or anti-realism about morality. Far from it. He is a moral realist par excellence, and he thinks that there are correct answers in circumstances about what we ought to do. So his system is not going to end up being committed to kind of relativism. Well, what's good for you is okay for you, and what's good for me is good. No, that's not Ross. Ross is not. He's not committed to any kind of relativism. In this way, he is considered a moral absolutist. Okay, so Ross gives us these prima facie duties. Hopefully the idea is clear as to how these duties are distinct from Kant's categorical duties. Okay, so what are these duties? Maybe I can say some things positively about what these prima facie duties are. Well, Ross gives us 7 of them. He doesn't intend his account to be exhaustive by any means, but he does take these to be equally fundamental moral principles that are supposed to guide us in our behavior. Okay, he begins with, in his discussion, duties of fidelity. These duties typically involve thinking about keeping promises or being truthful when we're engaged in conversations and the like with other people. There are also duties of reparation that feature as fundamental in Ross's system. So duties of reparation are duties that we have to repair the wrongs that we have caused. So we have the duties of reparation, and we have duties of gratitude. And these are pretty self-explanatory. We have these general duties to be grateful to our benefactors. They benefited us, and so we have duties to be grateful to them. We have duties of justice, and those duties of justice typically involve thinking about the distribution of goods, right, in society, or goods across our friendships and the like, or with respect to our loved ones. So we have general duties of justice. We have duties of beneficence even. So these are duties to help other people, to go about helping those who are in need around us and like. So these are kinds of positive duties that we have to actually positively benefit other people. Duties of beneficence. And this duty, Ross claims, is equivalent to the utilitarian principle, the duty to promote the happiness of all. The way we can benefit people in the utilitarian tradition is by promoting happiness. So we have this very general principle of beneficence that Ross claims is a fundamental prima facie duty. But there's also negative duty, the negative duty of non-maleficence, which involves duties not to harm other people. Okay, so it may be the case that that often the duties of non-maleficence, duties not to harm others, are going to be more stringent than our positive duties to benefit other people. But still, we get this equally fundamental prima facie duty, duties not to harm other people. He calls them duties of non-maleficence. And then the 7th category here of a principle of self-improvement. So we have a very general principle, a very general obligation to develop our characters, to improve our characters. So those are the 7 prima facie duties that Ross provides us with. Now, obviously, there are some perhaps hard questions that need to be dealt with here. How do we order them? Is there an ordering system in place? Well, according to Ross, there's no systematic lexical ordering system that one could develop for these principles. We have to, on Ross's view, and you may take this to be a virtue of his view, we have to look at the particular features of a circumstance to know which prima facie duty actually has ascendancy, or which prima facie duty is the most important and applies in a circumstance. We all know, don't we, that we face moral dilemmas, that we find ourselves in situations where we have to tell the truth in a circumstance or keep a promise in a circumstance, but at the same time, there could be another thing that happens to us that may conflict with our having to keep our promise. And Ross, he's well aware of the fact that there can be conflict. So he wants us to see how it is that the prima facie duty system can deal with cases of conflict. He can't give a systematic account. That's not what he's about. In fact, a pluralistic system might struggle in terms of working out an ethical theory with being perfectly systematic in these ways. And the reason why Ross wants to claim that he can't be perfectly systematic is, or near perfectly systematic, is just because we have to examine the particulars of a circumstance in order to know which of the prima facie duties is most pressing and most important. So let's see if we can understand how the prima facie duties are supposed to work and think about how they're supposed to work in the case of conflict, because we all know we're going to come into cases of moral conflict in our experiences, don't we? So here I'm going to be using Timmons's moral theory. He has a very nice chapter 9 of the book is dedicated basically to Rossian pluralism, and he gives us some cases to think about to help us see how Ross's system of prima facie duties works. So he gives us the case of, he calls it the important promise. So we have John and Jill feature in the case. And in this case, John has issued an important promise to Jill to pick her up to take her to a job interview. Jill's car is in the shop, so she can't get to this interview. It's an important promise because Jill really needs this job. Okay, so John's made this promise to her. And so interview day comes, John's driving over to Jill's house to pick her up, and he notices that there is a car that's broken down on the side of the road. The hood is up, and there's a person who's looking under the hood to see what could be wrong with the car. And John realizes, look, I've got this duty to help other people when they're in need. He has the duty of beneficence that's, in some sense, affecting his motivational system. It's a prima facie duty. Remember, we have the duty of beneficence, but we also have, and John has, the duty to keep his promises, the duty of fidelity. And so here we find a case where John is now in a case of moral conflict. He made a promise, it's an important promise, and the prima facie duty of keeping our promises is now pressing upon him. There's also the duty to help others when they're in need, so he has the duty of beneficence pressing on him, conflict. Okay, and what Ross is going to claim is, look, in this case, what John should do, all things being equal, is go and take his friend Jill to the appointment. Because the person who's on the side of the road may have other people who can help him. It doesn't look like he's in that serious of a situation. And then the promise he made to Jill, right? Her livelihood depends perhaps on getting this job and having a successful job interview. And she's not going to have a successful job interview if she doesn't show up for it in the first place. So that's the important promise case. The next case is the case of the car accident. So John, he's made a promise to Jill to come over to help her with a term paper. Maybe some of you can identify with that. And in this case, John, he heads over to Jill's place to help her with the term paper, and he notices that there's a car that is basically been flipped and wrecked, and there's an individual who's been thrown from the car and is in dire straits. And so now John, he has a case of moral conflict. He made a promise to his friend Jill, but now he also has a duty of beneficence. But in this case of conflict, it looks like John has a more pressing obligation to do what? To help the person who's been thrust from the car, whose life is in danger. So he made this important promise to his friend. It's not as important perhaps as the previous case, but it still is an important promise. You all know how term papers can be important. But in this case, it looks like, given the particular features of the case, what John should do is break his promise to Jill and help this person who's in dire straits from the car accident. So here we see that the particulars of the circumstance are going to determine what we ought to do, and there's no way in which we can just lexically prioritize the principles, because if we were to prioritize keeping our promises, then in the second case it looks like we'd end up with the wrong result. John would have to drive to Jill's house, help with the term paper, instead of helping this person who's about to die in front of him on the road. So hopefully these cases help us understand Ross's system of prima facie duties. We see how he's got a duty-based ethical system. Hopefully you understand Ross's normative pluralism better. I thank you all for watching. If you have any questions about Ross's view, let me know.